Today's story comes from a 73-year-old man who discovered his wife's biggest secret 3 months after burying her. Not an affair, not another family, a recording. One cassette tape that forced him to question 50 years of marriage in a single night. Hearing her voice again was painful enough, but what she confessed on that tape stayed with him long after it ended. The man who sent this story is named Richard. He lives alone now in a small coastal town in Maine. He wrote that he never imagined spending the final years of his life writing to strangers about the woman he loved most. But some truths arrive too late to carry quietly, and once they arrive, they don't really leave. Richard met his wife Eleanor during the summer of 1972. He was 20, working part-time at a hardware store while finishing community college. Eleanor worked at the public library a few blocks away. According to Richard, she wasn't the kind of woman who tried to stand out, but people noticed her anyway, because when she spoke, you listened properly. She listened carefully, he wrote, like every word mattered. That was what drew him in first. The second thing was harder to explain. Eleanor used to stand near windows for long stretches, watching people pass without saying anything. Richard used to joke about it. "What are you thinking about?" And she would say, "People carry whole lives around and nobody notices." Back then, he thought it was just her being thoughtful. Later, he realized she meant it more literally than he understood. They married young, built a life in Connecticut, and followed the pattern most people did at the time. 2 children, stable jobs, summer barbecues, Christmas cards every December. From the outside, everything looked steady, and for a long time Richard believed it was. But years have a way of revealing things you miss when you're busy living them. Looking back, he later admitted there were signs. Eleanor stayed up long after he went to bed. Sometimes he'd wake in the night and find her sitting in the living room under a single lamp. "Can't sleep," he'd ask. "Just thinking," she'd say. He never really asked what about. That stayed with him later more than anything else. "I stopped asking real questions," he wrote. Work took over most of his time. Not out of neglect, but because he believed that was how you looked after a family. More work meant more security, better schools, a stable future, and slowly, without any clear moment of change, their marriage became more about routine than connection. At dinner they talked about schedules, at night about errands and weather. Nothing dramatic changed between them. And maybe that's the part that's hardest to accept, because it never broke. It just thinned out over time. When Richard retired at 65, he thought things would finally feel different. More time together, more conversation, a chance to reconnect. But retirement didn't bring them closer. It just removed distractions, and what was left was something they hadn't really faced before. One evening, about 6 years before Eleanor died, they sat on the back porch watching the leaves fall across the yard. Eleanor asked him something out of nowhere. "Do you think 2 people can spend their whole lives together and still not really know each other?" Richard laughed a little. "I know you," he said. "You hate mushrooms and you cry at animal films." But Eleanor didn't smile. "That's not what I meant," she said, and then she looked away. That moment stayed with him longer than he realized at the time. But life moved on anyway, until it didn't. Eleanor became sick gradually. Fatigue first, then pain, then tests, then more tests. The diagnosis came quietly one afternoon. Late-stage pancreatic cancer. Richard later wrote that the doctor was kind, but kindness doesn't change what you're hearing. There would be treatment, but not recovery. Everything he thought mattered suddenly didn't. Work, plans, retirement goals. All of it dropped away. All he wanted was more time, and time didn't offer any negotiation. During Eleanor's final months, something shifted between them. Not suddenly, not in a dramatic way, but conversations came back. Not about schedules or routines, but about real things again. Memory, regret, fear. Sometimes they just sat together without talking, and that felt more honest than anything in years. Still, Richard noticed something he couldn't quite ignore. Eleanor was holding something back, not in a suspicious way. More like there were thoughts she had carried too long to say out loud. A week before she died, she asked him to clear the attic. She said she didn't want him dealing with it later. Richard spent the afternoon going through old boxes, photographs, documents, children's drawings, coats no one had worn in years. That's when he found it. A small cardboard box pushed behind folded blankets. One word written on top, private. He later admitted that word bothered him more than he expected. Not because it felt secretive, because it felt final. But he didn't open it. Not then. After Eleanor died, the house changed in ways that are hard to explain unless you've lived through it. Rooms felt unfamiliar. Even mornings felt slightly off. For weeks he moved through the days without much structure. Visitors came and went less often. His children returned to their own lives. And eventually, it was just him, and the house, and the absence of her presence in it. 3 months later, during a stormy evening, Richard went back into the attic looking for insurance papers. That's when he saw the box again, private. This time he opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, and several cassette tapes placed neatly beside an old recorder. Each tape had a date written on it, nothing else. Richard later said his hands started shaking before he even touched the first one. Not anger, something closer to fear of what he might learn. He chose one tape, 1989. The machine clicked, then static, then Eleanor's voice, young, clear, alive in a way that hit him harder than he expected. If anyone ever hears this, especially Richard, I suppose it means I finally ran out of time. He froze. The room didn't feel like his anymore. And in that moment he realized this wasn't going to be simple. It wasn't a confession meant to hurt him. It was something she could only say when she no longer had to live inside the reaction. The tapes continued. And what they revealed wasn't betrayal. It was something quieter. Eleanor had once wanted to be a writer. She had been accepted into a program in Boston at 22. Richard never knew she applied. She turned it down after finding out she was pregnant with their first child. I told myself there would be another chance, she said on one recording. There's always later when you're young, but later never came. Life became responsibility, then routine, then something that just had to be managed. And over time she stopped talking about who she might have been. One recording stood out, dated 1997. Eleanor sounded tired but steady. Today Richard got promoted, she said. He was proud. I told him I was happy, and I was. Then a pause. I just wish someone had once looked at me in this marriage and asked what I gave up to. Richard later wrote that he had to stop the tape after that, not because it was cruel, because it was true in a way he hadn't prepared for. The final tape came from 11 days before her death. Her voice was weaker now. Richard, she said, just his name, and it carried more weight than anything else she had ever said. If you're hearing this, I couldn't say it while I was still here. He braced himself. But what came wasn't blame. It was honesty. I stopped telling you who I was, she said. Not because you didn't care, but because I started to believe it didn't matter anymore. A pause. Then the line that stayed with him. I became so busy being needed, I forgot how to be known. Richard later admitted this was the moment everything shifted in how he understood their marriage. Not into guilt, but into clarity. Because he realized something simple. They hadn't broken each other. They had just slowly stopped noticing each other as people. The tape ended with something quieter. "You loved me," she said. "The best way you knew how." Then, after a pause, "I just wish we had both spoken sooner." The recording stopped and didn't continue again. Richard sat in the attic until morning, just listening to the rain and the empty space where her voice had been. In the months that followed, he read her writings, unfinished stories, fragments of ideas, notes she never turned into anything complete. And slowly he saw a version of her life he had never really understood while she was alive. Not someone who left, but someone who slowly disappeared inside a life that kept moving. A few months ago, Richard went to Boston alone. He sat near the area where Eleanor once studied writing and read one of her unfinished stories out loud. Not for meaning, just to hear it exist. He said people probably thought he was talking to himself. Maybe he was, but it didn't feel like that to him. And he ended his message with something that doesn't try to explain anything, just states it plainly. "The hardest part isn't losing someone," he wrote. "It's realizing how much of them you missed while they were still here. And maybe that's what stays. Not the ending, but the realization that sometimes people don't leave our lives all at once. They just slowly become someone we stop fully seeing. Until one day, all that's left is what we finally understand too late. Until one day, all that's left is what we finally understand too late."